Here's a super short video on just a solution I had. I wanted to build a little occasional table with tapered legs, and I wanted to make it out of some wood that I got that was slabbed up, and so I needed to make some kind of a cheapo jig to both taper the legs and cut a straight edge in rough sawn lumber. So I made it out of a piece of scrap plywood, some blocks of wood, some screws, and some nuts and bolts, and it worked great. As a tapering jig, I wanted the edge of the piece of plywood to be a reliable straight line to line up my legs to, so that I would get the exact taper I wanted. So I took a blank, which in this case was 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. I measured down 5 inches from the top, and that I made a line there, and that would become where my taper would start. I then flushed that up with the edge of the piece of plywood. Down at the other end of the leg, I drew a square, in this case 3/4 by 3/4, and I was going to have a 3/4 inch taper on two sides of the leg. Then you just simply keep that top edge flush with the edge of the plywood and rotate it there, just holding my finger against the plywood there and rotating the bottom of the leg out 3/4 of an inch flush with the edge of the plywood, clamp that down, and I would have my first taper. Then I'd simply rotate the leg 90 degrees and cut the second taper. And when you do that, you're going to get a cut would be along that line. And so here I am with the real deal. You can see there's a little pencil line on the leg where I wanted the taper to start. Just put some scrap, nothing but scrap, this whole thing, some scrap underneath those little blocks just to hold them a little more level. Again, they were just nuts and bolts countersunk into the bottom of the plywood. And just making sure that was flush. You could run it down here and get your first taper. The straight edge of the plywood also prevents tear out on the leg. And after getting that first taper, I just rotated the leg. Now it's the bottom of the leg going forward in order to keep a flush 90-degree side up against the plywood. And I cut my second taper, and I end up with a very nice tapered leg. Tapers like this are nice to clean up the saw cuts with a plane, because you're planing basically downhill with the grain, and it's planed super easily because of the taper cut that you've cut in the wood. And there's a finished tapered leg. I just did that 3 more times and had my 4 tapered legs for this little occasional table. And here they are, ready to be finished and planed. As for the other use of the jig, I just simply turned it around and laid the slabbed wood on the flat portion of the plywood. Used those same clamps to hold the piece of rough sawn wood down to the plywood. Again, the registration of the edge of the plywood is not important on this use. All I was trying to do is get something that would hold the wood firmly and give me a straight edge to run against the fence of my table saw. So again, just scrap junk as a spacer, and the same little blocks of wood. If you had a really bad edge on a piece of wood, all you do is simply make those blocks of wood longer. Again, they're just scrap, nothing. So you just make those blocks of wood longer, bolt that thing down to the plywood. Again, I just used literally a countersunk screw and a nut in order to get a nice cinch down connection so that the wood didn't flop around, and it gave me a nice long straight edge to run against my fence. Again, simply let the edge be off the ground, it doesn't really matter. All I'm trying to do right now is to get just a straight edge so that I can run against the fence when I flip the board around, to give me two straight edges that I can then refine later with either a joiner plane or the joiner. But it gives me a piece of workable lumber out of a pretty wacky shaped slab that came out of a friend's yard. So once I've measured to sort of the longest point, I simply run that jig against the fence, and look, I'm cutting off a whole bunch of the weird shape of that piece of wood. Then once you've done that first straight edge, obviously you just put the jig away, flip the piece of wood around, and run that new straight edge against the fence. And once I've done that, I've got about you could say it's about a 1x10, a 5/4 by 10 piece of wood I can mill out of a piece of pretty junky slabbed up wood. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If so, please subscribe, and thank you for watching. A pretty usable jig out of nothing but scrap plywood, scrap blocks of wood, and scrap nuts and bolts. Thanks again.